The failure initialized at 06:14:03 GMT on a Tuesday in October, originating not from a hardware malfunction or power disruption, but from a software patch deployed across the Scoot control hierarchy during the overnight maintenance window. The patch, designated V8.2.1-hotfix traffic priority, was intended to refine the weighting algorithms for emergency vehicle preemption at 240 strategic junctions along arterial corridors. What the deployment team did not anticipate was a cascading logic error embedded in the failsafe subroutine, a deeply nested conditional statement that evaluated intersection safety under ambiguous sensor input. The error was subtle. When the system detected conflicting occupancy data from induction loops at more than 3 approaching lanes simultaneously, it interpreted this as a critical sensor failure rather than normal peak hour saturation. The failsafe response, hard-coded into every UTC controller across the network, was unambiguous: enter safe state protocol, which meant setting all signal heads to red and maintaining that state until manual override from the central traffic control center. The patch had inadvertently lowered the threshold for what constituted conflicting data by a factor of 10, meaning that normal morning traffic, dense, multidirectional, and sensor-rich, now triggered the failsafe at scale. The first junction to lock was the voxel cross gyratory, where 17 induction loops reported simultaneous vehicle presence across 6 approach lanes. Within 90 seconds, the safe state command propagated via fiber optic link to every downstream controller in South London. By 06:18, the entire Scoot network south of the Thames had entered permanent red. By 06:23, the failure had crossed the river through the shared control backbones at Westminster, Waterloo, and Blackfriars, cascading north and east through the dense mesh of signal controllers that formed the circulatory system of the city. There was no explosion, no visible collapse, no announcement. The lights simply stopped cycling. Every intersection, from the smallest pedestrian crossing to the most complex multi-phase junction, displayed only red. And the system, confident in its logic, refused all attempts at remote override, interpreting each command as potentially unsafe given the sensor crisis it believed it was managing. The failure initialized at 06:14:03 GMT on a Tuesday in October, originating not from a hardware malfunction or power disruption, but from a software patch deployed across the Scoot control hierarchy during the overnight maintenance window. The patch, designated V8.2.1-hotfix-traffic priority, was intended to refine the weighting algorithms for emergency vehicle preemption at 240 strategic junctions along arterial corridors. What the deployment team did not anticipate was a cascading logic error embedded in the failsafe subroutine, a deeply nested conditional statement that evaluated intersection safety under ambiguous sensor input. The error was subtle. When the system detected conflicting occupancy data from induction loops at more than 3 approaching lanes simultaneously, it interpreted this as a critical sensor failure rather than normal peak hour saturation. The failsafe response, hard-coded into every UTC controller across the network, was unambiguous: enter safe state protocol, which meant setting all signal heads to red and maintaining that state until manual override from the central traffic control center. The patch had inadvertently lowered the threshold for what constituted conflicting data by a factor of 10, meaning that normal morning traffic, dense, multidirectional, and sensor-rich, now triggered the failsafe at scale. The first junction to lock was the Vauxhall Cross gyratory, where 17 induction loops reported simultaneous vehicle presence across 6 approach lanes. Within 90 seconds, the safe state command propagated via fiber optic link to every downstream controller in South London. By 06:18, the entire Scoot network south of the Thames had entered permanent red. By 023, the failure had crossed the river through the shared control backbones at Westminster, Waterloo, and Blackfriars, cascading north and east through the dense mesh of signal controllers that formed the circulatory system of the city. There was no explosion, no visible collapse, no announcement. The lights simply stopped cycling. Every intersection, from the smallest pedestrian crossing to the most complex multi-phase junction, displayed only red. And the system, confident in its logic, refused all attempts at remote override, interpreting each command as potentially unsafe given the sensor crisis it believed it was managing. The Thames crossings became pressure points within the first hour. London's river is crossed by only 35 vehicular bridges and tunnels, creating natural choke points in the city's topology. Each crossing is governed by multiple signal-controlled junctions on both approaches, designed to meter flow and prevent bridge saturation. When every signal locked to red, these junctions transformed from flow regulators into impermeable barriers. Tower Bridge, which normally processes 40,000 vehicles per day through a 6-phase signal system coordinating with the bridge lift mechanism, became entirely impassable. The northern approach, a 3-lane gyratory feeding from the A100, filled to capacity by 0645. Vehicles queued back along Mansell Street, then Minories, then into the Aldgate gyratory, which itself locked solid, propagating the gridlock west toward Liverpool Street and east toward Whitechapel. The same pattern repeated at every crossing. Vauxhall Bridge backed up into Victoria. Waterloo Bridge filled from both ends, trapping vehicles on the span itself with no ability to advance or retreat. The Blackwall Tunnel, a subterranean link carrying 50,000 vehicles daily, became particularly critical. Vehicles entering the tunnel on the south side found themselves unable to exit on the north due to the locked signals at the Blackwall Lane junction, creating a static column of traffic in an enclosed space with limited ventilation. Tunnel operators initiated emergency protocols, using loudspeaker systems to instruct drivers to switch off engines, but the physical reality remained. 1,200 vehicles were entombed underground with no mechanical means of extraction. The Thames, which had always divided London geographically, now divided it functionally. The city had been severed into discrete zones with no ability to exchange flow. Bus services, which represent 30% of London's public transport capacity, ceased operation by 0730. Transport for London's iBus system, which tracks every vehicle in real time and communicates with signal priority systems, registered the anomaly immediately but lacked override capability. Buses approaching red signals stopped as required, but unlike private vehicles, they could not simply wait indefinitely. Each bus on London's streets carries between 40 and 80 passengers and operates on a fixed route with scheduled timing points. When the signals failed to cycle, buses began to accumulate at junctions in clusters, often 3 or 4 vehicles per approach lane, creating bus-specific blockages within the larger gridlock. The night bus network, which had been completing its final runs of the overnight service, found itself unable to return to depots. Route N29, traveling from Trafalgar Square to Enfield, became stranded at the Camden Town Junction at 0641, unable to proceed north on the A400. The 73 buses already on the road when the failure occurred remained on the road, stationary, engines idling, passengers increasingly aware that something fundamental had broken. By 0800, TfL's control room had logged 4,890 buses as signal delayed, a euphemism that failed to capture the totality of the stoppage. The congestion charge zone, designed to reduce traffic density, became paradoxically the most congested area, as the high concentration of signalized junctions meant a correspondingly high density of red lights. The buses trapped there, serving routes like the 11, 15, 23, and 88, represented critical east-west and north-south links. Their immobilization effectively ended cross-city mobility for hundreds of thousands who depended on the network. Passengers began to disembark and walk, but the pavements, designed for pedestrian flow at normal densities, quickly became overcrowded. The city's transport network, engineered as an integrated system, had fragmented into isolated, non-functional components. Emergency services encountered the gridlock as an operational crisis by 0745. The London Ambulance Service, which maintains a target response time of 8 minutes for Category 1 life-threatening calls, found that target unreachable within the first hour of the failure. Ambulances dispatched to cardiac arrests, strokes, and major trauma incidents in central London could not physically reach their destinations. The vehicles were equipped with sirens and blue lights, legal permissions to violate traffic regulations, and drivers trained in emergency maneuvers, but none of these advantages could overcome the physical reality. Every lane of every road was occupied by stationary vehicles with nowhere to move. An ambulance dispatched at 0752 to a Category 1 call in Shoreditch, traveling from the Royal London Hospital in Whitechapel, required 34 minutes to cover 1.8 miles, navigating via pavement mounting, opposing traffic lanes on one-way streets, and ultimately abandoning the vehicle to continue on foot with portable equipment. The London Fire Brigade faced identical constraints. A fire reported at 0817 in a residential building in Clapham could not be reached by appliances from Clapham Fire Station, only 0.6 miles distant, because the South Circular Road was completely immobilized. The Metropolitan Police Service, which operates 2,600 vehicles across London, found its rapid response capability eliminated. Traffic officers, who would normally assist in clearing routes for emergency vehicles, were themselves trapped in the gridlock. The automated traffic enforcement cameras continued to record every emergency vehicle violation: ambulances crossing red lights, fire engines using bus lanes, police vehicles entering yellow box junctions. The system did not distinguish between criminal violations and emergency response. By 2009, the enforcement database had flagged 3,200 emergency service vehicles for penalty charges. The irony was acute. The system designed to enforce safety was now penalizing those attempting to preserve life. The morning peak, which typically reaches maximum flow between 08 and 9:30, never arrived in the traditional sense. Instead, the city experienced a compression event, where the normal inward flow of commuters encountered a network with zero absorptive capacity. The orbital motorway system, the M25, which encircles Greater London at a radius of 15 to 20 miles, became a secondary containment boundary. Vehicles traveling on the M25 with the intention of exiting onto radial routes toward the city found those exit junctions backed up to the motorway itself. The A1M southbound exit at Junction 23, which feeds into North London via the A1, developed a queue extending 4 miles back onto the motorway by 08. The M4 eastbound, approaching Junction 3 for Hayes and Harlington, slowed to stationary conditions by 015, with congestion propagating west past Heathrow Airport. The M11 southbound, the A12, the A13, the A2, the A20, the A23, the A3, and the A40, every arterial road feeding into London experienced the same hydraulic back pressure. The queuing was not chaotic or disorderly, it was methodical, deterministic, and total. The National Traffic Monitoring System, operated by National Highways, registered the anomaly as the worst congestion event in recorded history, surpassing even the King's Cross fire evacuation of 1987 or the July 2005 bombings. But this was not a localized event requiring diversion. There was no alternative route. The city had become a gravitational well for vehicles, drawing them in through the arterials and orbital roads, but providing no mechanism for circulation or exit. By 2009, an estimated 1.2 million vehicles were stationary on London's roads, representing approximately 70% of the city's daily traffic volume compressed into non-movement. The commercial freight network, which sustains London's economy through 300,000 delivery movements per day, experienced immediate paralysis. Heavy goods vehicles, which are restricted to specific routes and time windows due to weight and emissions regulations, found themselves immobilized at the exact locations they were legally permitted to be. The Dartford crossing, which carries the M25 across the Thames and processes 50 million vehicles annually, locked completely by 07 as the signal-controlled merge zones on both the Kent and Essex approaches entered safe state. This crossing is critical infrastructure. It handles 20% of all UK-Europe freight traffic. By 2009, 4,000 HGVs were stationary in the approach lanes, representing shipments of perishable goods, manufacturing components, pharmaceutical supplies, and retail stock. The Port of London Authority, which coordinates commercial shipping and road freight through Tilbury and London Gateway ports, reported that container collection schedules had collapsed entirely. Refrigerated vehicles carrying food destined for supermarkets across the southeast began to exhaust their fuel reserves. The auxiliary diesel engines powering the refrigeration units consume approximately 4 liters per hour, and most vehicles carry only enough fuel for 24-hour operation. The distribution centers in Park Royal, Enfield, and Croydon, which serve as consolidation points for Greater London's supply chain, could neither receive inbound shipments nor dispatch outbound deliveries. The city's logistics infrastructure operates on just-in-time principles, with minimal buffer stock. The immobilization of the freight network meant that hospital pharmacies, supermarkets, and fuel stations would begin experiencing shortages within 24 to 48 hours. The failure had not merely stopped commuters, it had interrupted the material flow that sustains an urban population of 9 million. The underground network, which operates independently of road infrastructure, experienced a 340% surge in demand by 9 a.m. Commuters who had abandoned gridlocked buses or who had assessed the road situation and chosen not to drive converged on tube stations across zones 1 through 6. Stations with major road interchanges, King's Cross, Victoria, Waterloo, London Bridge, became critically overcrowded within 30 minutes. Transport for London's passenger counting systems, which use optical sensors at gate lines and platforms, registered flow rates 15 to 20% above the theoretical maximum capacity for station infrastructure. At Oxford Circus, where 4 lines intersect and normal morning peak handles 42,000 entries per hour, the demand exceeded 58,000 by 9:15. Station staff implemented crowd control measures, closing entrances temporarily and allowing only one-in, one-out flow. But this created surface-level crowding on Oxford Street, Regent Street, and Argyle Street. The pedestrian infrastructure, designed for retail flow, could not accommodate dense stationary crowds. The Central Line, which runs east-west through the city center and is already the most congested line in the network, experienced in-train densities of 8 to 9 passengers per square meter, beyond the comfort and safety thresholds. The Northern Line, a critical north-south link, faced similar conditions. Passengers who successfully boarded trains found themselves in crush conditions for the entire journey, unable to exit at their intended stations due to platform crowding. The automated announcements on platforms, "Please move down inside the cars," became physically impossible to obey. By 10 o'clock, London Underground had recorded 12 medical incidents related to crowding, fainting, panic attacks, and 1 suspected cardiac event. The system, which represents London's last functioning high-capacity transport mode, was being overwhelmed by displacement demand from the failed road network. The city's vertical infrastructure, its tunnels and subterranean platforms, was absorbing the pressure that the horizontal infrastructure could no longer manage. The Traffic Control Center on Palestra Building, Blackfriars Road, became the coordination node for the crisis by 8:30. The facility, which normally monitors signal performance and adjusts scoot parameters in response to real-time conditions, found itself without leverage. The primary UTC control system, which interfaces with all 6,000-plus signal controllers across the city, was receiving telemetry correctly. Every controller was reporting healthy power, communication, and lamp function, but was rejecting all override commands. The fail-safe logic, once engaged, prioritized its internal safety assessment over external instruction. The engineers, who had designed the system with multiple redundancy layers to prevent unauthorized tampering or cyber attack, now confronted the unintended consequence. The system could not be easily overwritten even by its own operators. The manual override process, documented in emergency procedures, required physical access to each individual controller cabinet, authentication with a mechanical key, and manual switching to isolated mode. There are 6,000 such cabinets distributed across 607 square miles. Even if every available traffic engineer and contractor were mobilized immediately, the process would require days. By 9 a.m., Transport for London had activated its emergency response protocols, establishing contact with the Department for Transport, the Greater London Authority, and the Metropolitan Police. The initial assessment, communicated via secure channels, was unambiguous. There was no rapid technical solution. The system would need to be reset junction by junction, a process requiring manual intervention at each site. The estimated time to restore normal operation? 36 to 48 hours, assuming 24-hour staffing and no complications. The city, which had engineered its traffic management to be robust and automated, now discovered that automation had created a single point of failure that could not be rapidly reversed. The sophistication of the system, its networked architecture and fail-safe logic, had become a vulnerability. By 1800, 14 hours into the failure, London had entered a state of functional suspension. The evening peak, which would normally see 1.8 million vehicle movements outbound from the city center, could not occur. The vehicles that had entered during the morning or that had been present when the failure began remained stationary. Fuel exhaustion became a secondary crisis. The average vehicle carries sufficient fuel for 300 to 400 miles of mixed driving, but idling consumes 0.6 to 0.8 liters per hour. Vehicles that had been stationary since 0630, running engines intermittently for heating or air conditioning, began to deplete their tanks by mid-afternoon. By 1800, the roadside assistance organizations, AA, RAC, and Green Flag, had received 89,000 calls for fuel delivery, but their response vehicles were themselves unable to navigate the gridlock. The enforcement camera system, still operating without awareness of the systemic failure, had logged 1.4 million violations by evening, a number so large that it triggered automatic error flags in the penalty charge notice generation system. The database, designed to handle approximately 2,000 violations per day across the entire city, could not process the volume. The first engineers reached isolated junction cabinets by 1600, traveling on foot or by motorcycle through the gridlocked streets, and began the manual reset process. Each reset required 12 to 15 minutes. Key authentication, diagnostic checks, switching to isolated mode, verifying lamp function, re-establishing fiber communication with the control center, and finally enabling local signal timing plans. By 1800, 47 junctions had been reset, less than 1% of the network. The city would remain locked until the following day and possibly beyond. The river crossings would be prioritized, then the arterial routes, then the secondary network. Restoration would be incremental and slow. London, which had been built on layers of Victorian infrastructure, wartime resilience, and digital optimization, had been stopped by a logic error in a software patch. The city had not been attacked or damaged, it had been protected into paralysis, and in the red glow of 6,000 stationary signals, the metropolis waited, motionless, for human hands to undo what automated logic had done.